Welcome to this experimental watercolour trees tutorial. Let's get started. I'm using a wax crayon, but you can use a wax candle or an oil pastel, a white oil pastel or white crayon. I'm rubbing it onto the watercolour surface. It's cold pressed and I'm sort of doing vertical lines, and these are to represent birch trees. And I'm just sort of also drawing at the top there some smaller branches. I'm using my Spritzer bottle to wet the surface to create sort of random sort of textured marks with the water. You can just wet it with a large soft haired brush. Mixing up some turquoise there, a little bit of yellow, some yellow ochre, or you could use raw sienna, big puddles. And I've got some burnt sienna here, again another big puddle. I'm using my size 8 brush to mix with. This is some Paynes grey. This is all going to be for my first layer. I'm also mixing up a little bit of yellow with some of the green there, some Cascade green. Any green will do. So I'm starting off really with quite a dirty brush. That's the Paynes grey with the raw sienna. Loading my brush with some yellow, a little bit of the sort of cerulean or turquoise. And as you can see, the wax resist is resisting the watercolour. Now I'm really throwing the paint on here. So I'm adding some more yellows and really just expressing myself. It's a lovely way of warming up before you start a watercolour. Loading my brush with some of the raw sienna there and just really covering all of the paper with these kind of lighter washes. Because the paint is quite watery, the washes will be quite light. So I'm adding some blue and I'm tilting now, allowing the colours to blend on the paper and drizzle down as well. It's quite exciting. You may feel this is a little bit out of control, but it's a great way of learning about watercolour as well, using it wet with lots of water. So I'm adding a little bit of phthalo blue here, more damp into wet, along with some burnt sienna. And what that means, damp into wet, is the paint is thicker than the surface. The surface is very wet, so I haven't got as much water. I'm using some Paynes grey now, and this is kind of for the trees. So I'm really trying to use this dark creamy paint to bring out the wax, so the wax shows up, and I'm tilting now, allowing all that paint to run down into the foreground as well. Don't worry, I am going to make sense of this. Just trust the process. It's so much fun. It can create the most atmospheric, sort of semi-abstract paintings as well. What I'm doing now is I'm just spattering some of the yellow there, wet into wet. And then just loading my brush with some more yellow, painting it wet into wet. Just trying to get some really yummy background colours. A little bit more blue here, wet into wet, using my size 10 round brush. You saw that I put loads of yellow there, and now I'm tilting. Again, it's very wet, my painting, and all the paint's just running down, using the brush to kind of manipulate it as well, and then mopping up with my paper towel. So I'm using some brush show here, and a link for my brush show tutorial can be found in the description. So I've pierced a hole in the top of the lid, and this allows the pigment to fall onto the wet surface. I'm now actually going to show you what it looks like. So I'm taking off the tab there, opening up, and you can see this is a crystalline ink powder. And it's very vibrant, and you get all these different colours, and it creates the most amazing textures. But a little goes a long way, so I'm tapping the bottom there, allowing the brush to fall onto the wet surface, and it kind of fixes itself. But it also kind of spreads, and you can see all these kind of colours developing. Alternatives to brush show can be found in the description. I'm now using salt and a plastic card. So tutorials for both of those can be found in the description below, but I've sprinkled on the salt onto the wet surface. And what that does, it absorbs the paint and creates lovely light textures once dry. I'm using the plastic card here to lift the paint, but also to scratch into the surface. And what happens there is the paint runs into the scratch to make sort of darker, thinner lines, This is permanent, but it's a really effective way to sort of create thin lines, branches, etc. So again, you saw there, I was tilting, using the plastic card, sort of lifting, creating grasses here now, sort of swiping into the wet surface, and then sort of drawing and scratching into the paper to create those thin branches. You can be so expressive just using a plastic card. I'm using the sharp corner here to create these thin lines. Again, I'm spattering, using this time some lavender, and it's quite an opaque sort of lavender colour. I'm using a size 8 round brush to spatter it onto the damp surface. And because it's opaque, it kind of sort of stands out against the sort of background colours there. Slightly creamier as I'm spattering. And now if you don't have lavender, don't worry. You could add some white to some ultramarine or cobalt blue, or mix the cobalt blue or the ultramarine with a little bit of pink as well. So you're creating wild flowers really. And you can also do this wet on dry. So I'm spattering some creamy yellow there onto the wet surface, mixing it with a little bit of blue and just spattering this limey green colour wet into wet. Adding a little bit more water to that yellow and just spattering away and just building up these sort of colours here. Again, you can allow it to dry and then start doing this wet on dry. That's the lovely thing about this. You can be so experimental with these techniques. So mixing up a darker green here, using some turquoise, Paynes grey and yellow, lots and lots of paint, and just spattering this paint almost wet on dry in that right hand corner. So my painting is drying off a little. Some areas, as you can see, where it's very shiny is really wet. So the salt as well is absorbing, so you can see when it's dry how well that works creating textures. So still sort of spattering this sort of mid to dark green here and there, building up details, building up textures. And what happens with wet in wet spattering, the edges are very soft. If you spatter wet on dry, the edges are much more crisp. So just spattering a little bit more of that lavender. And now I'm using the plastic card. I'm actually dipping it into the paint and then applying it to the damp surface. So I often freshly squeeze tube paint into my pans. They're not actually pans there. They were empty pans, which I always fill with tubed paint. Now, sometimes that tube paint, when I'm not using my paints, will dry off. I usually spritz my paints about 30 minutes before I use them, just to moisten them up, and I spritz them with water. So what I'm doing here is creating the marks that you get on a silver birch tree, and just sort of applying this thick paint to the damp surface. And it's just starting to look like trees now. It's still quite abstract, but you can see those lavender flowers looked all soft and pretty, and now bringing out the sort of markings on these silver birch trees. And the wax has worked really well in places. The only thing sometimes about using wax is you can't see where you've put it, so it can be a bit tricky, but it kind of is fun as well, and it keeps everything loose and abstract. So I'm still printing on this Paynes grey. If you don't have Paynes grey, don't worry, you could use black or indigo, or mix ultramarine and burnt sienna together. And what I'm doing now is I'm just softening this hard edge here. It just looked a bit awkward, so I'm just softening it back there with a clean damp brush, and I'm spattering just white gouache. You can use white watercolor or white acrylics. I'm just spattering this with my size 6 round brush, and I like the way it kind of bursts a little bit there, and they look like little flowers there beneath the trees in the foreground. So I'm going to allow my painting to dry naturally to allow the salt to work. And as you can see there's some lovely textures. Look at the top left there. All those markings is left from the salt. Look down the center of the trees, more sort of textures and light markings again from the salt. So what I'm doing now is I'm painting wet on dry. I'm using a Reservoir brush. You can use a liner brush or even a twig to apply this dark paint. It's burnt sienna mixed with Paynes grey. So I'm actually just painting some branches at the top of the trees here, just to create some detail and interest, and just to bring my painting to life, almost to kind of make sense of it in a way. And little details like that really can help. So I am just using this Reservoir brush, just painting these thin lines, wet on dry. Details about this brush can be found in the description below. What I'm doing now is I've mixed up some very dilute paint. I've used Ultramarine and a little bit of the burnt sienna. And I'm just painting wet on dry the sort of left side of the trees to create some shadow, to make them look a little bit more 3D. You may find it tricky to do this because of the wax resist, so just paint next to the wax resist to make the tree slightly wider. So you're actually sort of painting the background, but it kind of gives the illusion of some shadow at the edge there. Just keep everything really super loose. And I am mixing up a little bit of green here with some of the ultramarine, painting wet on dry, some darker grasses there, using my size 4 round brush, adding some more yellow here as well. So you've got some lighter grasses. So just building up some of the detail. Now I'm spattering wet on dry now. You can see the difference. You get a lot more sparkle and texture. So I've got a big puddle of yellow-green paint. That's some yellow mixed with a pinch of blue or even green. And I'm now adding a touch more green, so it's a bit more of a mid-green here, and spattering wet on dry. The green's slightly darker now because I've just added some more green to that paint, and spattering it to the top part of the trees there to create the look of foliage. And I'm also spattering just at the bottom of the trees to kind of ground them a little bit as well. Just mixing up a little bit more of the yellow, spattering with my size 4 round brush just here and there. Getting a little bit more of that yellow. I just love to spatter, as you can see. I'm now spattering a little bit more of the lavender, this time wet on dry. And as you can see, I've got some lovely, beautiful wildflowers developing there, along with the yellow as well. I've decided to add some white gouache to the lavender, so it's a lighter colour. Now remember, you can actually add the white to other watercolour colours like the ultramarine mixed with some permanent rose. And I'm spattering this colour pretty much beneath the trees there, wet on dry. I'm mixing some of that white into the green and spattering this lighter green here and there, again with my size 4 brush. Using the white now to paint in some smaller, thinner, lighter branches. You saw there, I actually put my brush into the tube there to get just literally it straight from the tube, and then just applying sort of thin lines to the background as well, wet on dry, and just adding these sort of final sort of details here and there really does bring the painting to life. Adding some more whites onto the tree, using the side of the brush to create some texture and more light there to bring them forward as well. Using a cocktail stick here to scratch into the paint to create more details and textures. Adding some more white here and there, using my size 4 round brush to give the impression of the texture of the tree. So it's quite a good idea if you've gone a bit mad with your wax, which I have a little bit here. You can actually add the white paint and it goes quite nicely over the top of the wax, whereas the watercolour resists the wax. So I'm just taking off the washi tape to reveal a lovely white border. And I've decided to add a few more lighter branches using the white gouache, wet on dry, using that Reservoir brush, but you could use a liner brush or a rigger brush. And it just kind of brings these trees to life and just adds more details. So here is the finished painting. I really hope you enjoyed this experimental tree watercolour landscape tutorial. And as a bonus to my members, I have another tutorial using very similar techniques but also using brush show. If you'd like to support the content that I create here on YouTube and get access to my exclusive content, why not think about joining my Patreon membership? Details about the membership can be found in the description below and you can cancel anytime. Thank you so much for watching this tutorial. Happy painting. Bye for now.